I didn't say a word. Not when I found the text, not when I read it twice, then a third time making sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Not when I sat down on the edge of the bathtub at 11:47 at night with my reading glasses still on and my heart doing something I don't have a name for. I just sat there, in the quiet. My son was getting married in 3 days. Let me tell you something about my son. He is the kind of man who still calls me every Sunday morning without fail, not because I asked him to, not because I reminded him. He just does. Has done it since he moved out at 22, and he's 34 now. 12 years of Sunday calls. His name is Nolan. He got his father's jaw and his grandmother's patience, and somehow, somewhere along the way, he got a heart that's too generous for this world. His fiancée's name was Petra. I want to be fair when I talk about her. I want to be careful, because even now, even after everything, I don't think she was entirely what I first believed her to be. But I'll get to that. I met Petra about 2 years before the wedding. Nolan brought her to Thanksgiving. She was polished. That's the word I kept coming back to. Polished. Good manners, nice shoes, remembered everyone's names. My husband, Harold, took to her immediately. He kept passing her the sweet potatoes. Kept laughing at things she said. I noticed it, the way he leaned in when she spoke. But I told myself I was being a difficult mother-in-law before I'd even been given the chance. Harold and I had been married for 36 years at that point. We'd built a life together, a real one, with all the rough edges that come with that. We'd had our seasons of distance, our years of closeness. I knew his habits, his silences, the exact pitch of his laugh when something was actually funny versus when he was performing. I thought I knew everything there was to know about that man. I was wrong about that. The text wasn't even addressed to me. That's the thing. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, because I've replayed that night 100 times and I still feel the need to explain myself, which maybe says something about the kind of woman I am. Harold had left his phone on the kitchen counter when he went to take a shower. My phone was upstairs charging and I needed to check the weather because I was trying to figure out if I should bring a different pair of shoes to the rehearsal dinner. That's all. I just picked it up to check the weather. The screen lit up. The message was from a number with no name attached. Just digits. And the message said, "I need to talk to you before Saturday. I can't go through with this without telling him." I stood there for a moment. Then I set the phone down exactly as I found it, and I walked upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bathtub, and I breathed. I'm 63 years old. I have survived a lot of things. I buried my mother when I was 41. My father 2 years after that. I had a cancer scare at 55 that turned out to be nothing but took 10 years off my life in the 6 weeks before the biopsy results came back. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. But that night, in my bathroom in Charlotte, North Carolina, I came close. I didn't say anything to Harold when he came out of the shower. I said I had a headache and I turned over and I stared at the wall until I heard his breathing go slow and even. Then I thought, the number. I needed to know whose number it was. I'm not particularly good with technology, but I have a niece who is. Her name is Wren. She's 28 and she treats her phone like a fifth limb. I texted her the next morning while Harold was out getting his car washed. He always got his car washed before important events. It was one of his things. And I told her I needed to reverse search a phone number and I didn't know how to do it. She called me back in 4 minutes. "Auntie, you can use one of those search sites," she said. "I'll just do it for you. Send me the number." I did. She was quiet for longer than I expected. "Auntie." Her voice had changed. "This is registered to a Petra Vance." I already knew. Some part of me, from the moment I read that message, had already put it together. But hearing it out loud, hearing my niece say that name, her voice careful and confused and trying to figure out what to do with the information, that was different. I thanked her. I told her I would explain later. I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold in front of me. And I thought about my son calling me every Sunday for 12 years. I want you to understand why I didn't call Nolan right then. Because that's the question, isn't it? That's what you'd ask. That's what anyone would ask. Why didn't you just pick up the phone? Here's why. Because I had a text message and a phone number. That was it. I had a message that said I need to talk to you before Saturday, and a name that matched my son's fiancée. It didn't say what I thought it said. Not in words, not in any way I could prove to anyone, least of all to Nolan, who loved this woman. If I went to him with that, he would go to her. She would deny it. Harold would deny it. And I would be the mother who tried to destroy her son's wedding based on a text message she had no business reading off her husband's phone. I needed more. I also needed to know, what was Harold's part in this? Was this something ongoing? Was it something that had ended? The message said she couldn't go through with this without telling him. Telling who? Nolan? Harold? Both? I had 2 days before the rehearsal dinner. 3 days before the wedding. I went back to Harold's phone that afternoon while he was napping. I know how that sounds, but I was past caring how it sounded. I went through his messages, his call log, his email. I was methodical about it. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that, how steady my hands were. What I found wasn't a long affair. It wasn't years of deception. It was, as best as I could piece together from deleted fragments and timestamps I had to work to reconstruct, about 6 months. It had started the previous spring. It had ended, based on the messages I could find, about 3 months before the wedding. There was one message from Harold, sent in August, that I read 4 times. He said, "This was a mistake, and it can never happen again. I love my wife. Please don't contact me." And she had respected that, until now. Until 2 days before her own wedding to my son. I called my sister, Claudette, that evening. I told Harold I was going to the grocery store, and I sat in my car in the Harris Teeter parking lot on Providence Road, and I called her, and I told her everything. Claudette is 71, and she raised 4 children, and she has the kind of voice that could talk someone down off a ledge. She didn't panic. She didn't gasp. She just listened. When I finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," I said. "Do you want to stop the wedding?" "I want to protect my son." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Those might not be the same thing." I thought about that for a long time. Here's the conclusion I came to, alone, in a grocery store parking lot in Charlotte. If I went to Nolan the night before his wedding with this, I would break him. He would have to make an impossible decision with no time to think, no time to process, no space to feel what he needed to feel. He would be humiliated in front of people he'd known his whole life, cancelling a wedding the night before it happened. Or he would push it down and go through with it, and never fully trust any of it afterward. And there was another thing. Petra had reached out to Harold because she wanted to tell Nolan. That message, "I can't go through with this without telling him," meant she was going to say something. She was carrying this into her own marriage, and she knew it, and she was trying to do something about it, however badly. I didn't know what would happen if I did nothing, but I knew what would happen if I acted too soon, so I decided to wait, and I decided to be there when it happened. Whatever it was, the rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Dilworth called The Larder. Private room, about 40 people. Nolan wore a navy jacket and kept touching Petra's elbow the way he always does when he's nervous and excited at the same time. I watched him. I smiled at everyone who spoke to me. Harold sat next to me all evening and refilled my water glass twice, and at one point put his hand on my knee. And I looked at him, and I thought about 36 years, and I thought about that message in August where he said, "I love my wife." And I felt sick, and I felt something else, something I couldn't name yet but would understand better later. Petra looked at me once across the room when Nolan had gone to speak to someone else. It was a long look, not guilty exactly, more like bracing herself, like she was waiting for something. I held her gaze, and I gave her nothing. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the armchair in our bedroom and I watched Harold sleep, and I thought about what I was going to say to him and when. I decided that conversation had to come after. It had to come after everything else, after the smoke had cleared. Because if I confronted him first, the whole thing would collapse inward, and Nolan would be standing at an altar, wondering why his parents weren't there. I put on my dress at 8 the next morning. It was sage green, knee-length. I'd bought it in September before any of this. I put on pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. I did my hair the way I always do. I went to my son's wedding. The ceremony was at a small church in Myers Park that Petra's family attended. Beautiful old wood, afternoon light coming through the windows in slanted pieces. I sat in the front pew on the left side. Wren sat next to me. She held my hand without me asking her to, and I was grateful for that. Nolan was at the altar looking like the version of himself that makes me believe I did something right. He was so happy. That's the only word for it, just entirely, openly happy, the way children are before they learn to guard it. Petra walked in on her father's arm, and she was lovely. She was. Even then, even knowing what I knew, I could see why my son had chosen her. There was something genuine in her, something the polish didn't cover up, and I held on to that because I needed something to hold on to. The ceremony went forward. The vows were said. I said nothing. I know. I hear you. I know. But here's what happened. 40 minutes after the ceremony ended, during the cocktail hour, before the reception had fully begun, I saw Petra excuse herself from a group of guests near the bar. I saw her walk down the hallway toward the restrooms. I watched her go, and then I followed her. I found her in the small sitting area off the main hallway, away from everyone. She was standing with her back to me, looking out a narrow window at the parking lot, still in her dress. She knew I was there before I said anything. I could see it in her shoulders. I said her name. She turned around and her eyes were already wet. I said, "You reached out to my husband. I know." She didn't deny it. She didn't even look surprised that I knew. She just looked exhausted, the way people look when they've been carrying something too long and someone finally acknowledges the weight. She said I was going to tell him. I was going to tell Nolan, before the ceremony. I had written it all out. I had the words. She pressed her lips together. I lost my nerve. I looked at this woman in her wedding dress, with her mascara threatening to run, and I said, "Tell me why." What came out of her over the next 20 minutes was not what I expected. She told me it hadn't started the way I probably thought. She'd been going through something last spring. Her mother's health had deteriorated sharply. She was spending every weekend in Greenville, driving back and forth. She was depleted and frightened and not sleeping. She and Nolan had been arguing. She'd come to our house one afternoon to drop something off, and Harold had been home alone. They'd talked. That's how she said it. We talked. And then, eventually, it had become something else. She said, "I know that doesn't excuse it." She said, "I've spent every day since August hating myself." She said, "I love your son. I need you to know that. I love him, and I don't deserve him, and both of those things are true at the same time." She had a small journal in the clutch she was carrying. She'd had it this whole time, she said. She'd written everything in it. Dates, conversations, how it had started, how it ended, why. She'd intended to give it to Nolan and let him decide. She'd chickened out. I stood there in that hallway and I looked at the journal and I thought about my son at the altar 40 minutes ago, his face open and certain. I said, "Give me the journal." She hesitated. I said, "You're not going to have this conversation with my son on his wedding day. Not like this, not with 200 people 20 feet away." I looked at her. "But you are going to have it, and soon. You understand me?" She nodded. "If you don't tell him," I said, "I will." "That's not a threat. That's just the truth." She nodded again. Her hands were shaking around the clutch. I said, "Wipe your face. Go back to your reception. And Petra, when you do tell him everything. All of it. He deserves all of it." I walked back down the hallway. I returned to my table. I ate the salmon. I danced with Nolan during the father-son, mother-son dance, I should say, because Harold wasn't up to it. Said his knee was bothering him, which we both knew wasn't true. I held my son and I breathed him in, and I thought, "You are going to be okay. Whatever comes next, you are going to be okay," she told him 9 days later. I found out from Nolan himself on a Sunday morning. He called at the usual time, but his voice was different and I knew before he said a word. He said, "Mom, I need to tell you something. And then he said, did you know? I told him the truth. I told him everything, finding the text, Wren's search, going through Harold's phone, the conversation in the hallway. I didn't soften it. He deserved the full version. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, why didn't you stop the wedding? I told him what I'd told myself in the Harris Teeter parking lot, that I was trying to protect him, that I needed him to have the information with space around it, not in a panic with a room full of people waiting, that I believed Petra when she said she was going to tell him. I just didn't believe she'd find the courage at the right moment without someone making it clear she had no other option. He said, so you made her. I said, I gave her a deadline. Another long silence. He said, I'm so angry, Mom. I know. I don't know who I'm most angry at. I said, that's fair. You can be angry at me too. I can take it. He cried a little then, just briefly. He's like his father that way, doesn't like to cry on the phone. And then he collected himself and we stayed on with each other for another 2 hours, talking, not talking, just being there. He filed for annulment in February. The process took about 3 months. His lawyer, a woman in his firm's network, handled most of it. There were no children, no shared property, no real entanglements. Clean, as these things go. Harold and I, that was a different conversation. A longer one that I won't describe in detail because some of it belongs only to the two of us. What I'll say is this, I didn't decide immediately, I didn't forgive immediately. I sat with what I knew for weeks, and I had hard conversations. And I went to see a counsellor on Thursday mornings at an office on Sharon Amity Road, a woman named Dr. Elaine Whitfield, who said very little and listened very well. Harold went to see his pastor. We both did a lot of sitting in rooms where someone else held the space. After 4 months, I told Harold I was willing to try, not to go back to what we had. I don't think what we had was entirely sound, and I think some of the cracks had been there a long time before Petra walked into our kitchen. But to build something different, to see what was still there underneath 36 years. It's slow. I won't pretend otherwise. Some mornings are fine, and some mornings I wake up and the whole thing settles back onto my chest and I have to breathe through it again. But we're still here. Both of us trying. What I think about most now is not Harold, and not even Petra. I think about my son. He calls me every Sunday. He still does. The calls are different now, more serious in some ways, more tender in others. He talks about what he wants, his job, where he wants to live, whether he wants children. He talks to me like I'm someone who can be trusted with the real version of his life, and I think about how many mothers never get that, and I hold it carefully. He told me once, a few months after the annulment was final, that he'd been thinking about what I'd done. Not just the wedding, all of it, the patience of it. He said, I used to think love was about telling people everything the minute you knew it, but that's not always right, is it? I said, no. Sometimes love is about timing. He thought about that for a while. Then he said, he didn't protect me from the pain. He just made sure I could actually feel it. I said, that's exactly right. We were quiet together for a little while, the way you can be quiet with someone when the silence is full rather than empty. Then he asked if I'd watched the game the night before, and I said I had, and we talked about that for 45 minutes. That's my son. That's my Sunday. That's what I was protecting when I sat in that hallway at his wedding and told a woman in a white dress that the truth was going to come out one way or another and that she had a choice about how it happened. I don't regret it. The thing about being 63, about having survived everything that number implies, you stop needing people to understand your decisions. You stop needing to be called a hero. You just know what you did and why, and you live with it, the whole weight of it, and some days the weight is grief, and some days it's something closer to grace. I chose grace when I could. I chose my son every single time. I've been thinking a lot about cause and effect lately, not in any grand cosmic way, just the plain human kind. The kind where you trace a line backward from where you are now, and you can see, if you're honest, exactly how you got there. Harold made a choice last spring. Petra made a choice too. Those choices set something in motion that none of us could fully stop once it started, only shape, only redirect. The truth was always going to come out. That's the thing about secrets that involve more than one person. They don't stay buried, they just wait. What I keep coming back to is this. The outcome of a situation isn't only determined by what happens to you, it's determined in large part by what you do with the time between when you find out and when you act. That stretch of time, that's where character lives. I could have screamed at Harold the night I found that text. I could have called Nolan at midnight and blown the whole thing open. I could have stood up in that church and said something. Every single one of those choices would have been understandable. Most people, I think, would have made at least one of them. And I won't pretend I didn't want to. I wanted to badly, in the way you want to throw something when you're angry enough. But I've lived long enough to know that the most satisfying response in the moment is often the most damaging one in the long run. That's not wisdom you're born with. That's something you earn, slowly, through the times you didn't wait and wish you had. What I did instead required something I'd like to call intelligence. Not the kind measured by any test, but the kind that asks, what does this situation actually need from me? Not what does my pain need, not what would feel good right now. What does the situation need? My son needed the truth with space around it. He needed to receive it as a whole person standing on solid ground, not as a groom at an altar with nowhere to go. And Petra. I think about what it took for her to carry that journal to her own wedding. That's not nothing. That's a woman who knew she'd done wrong and was trying, badly and too late, to find a way back toward something honest. I'm not excusing her. But I'm also not pretending I didn't see it. The thing about integrity is that it doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in the small, invisible decisions, the ones nobody sees you make. Sitting in that parking lot, walking back down that hallway, eating the salmon, dancing with my son. Nolan is rebuilding now, slowly, the way you rebuild anything that mattered. Carefully, with attention, without rushing. He calls me every Sunday. That hasn't changed. If anything, those calls have more weight now, more honesty in them. He told me once that he came out of all of this understanding himself better than he did going in. That's not a small thing. That's the only thing, really. I don't know what the rest of Harold's and my story looks like. I know what I'm willing to try for. That has to be enough for now. What I know for certain is this. Loving someone well sometimes means holding the hardest truth long enough to deliver it in a way they can actually survive. That's not deception, that's care. And it costs something. It costs you sleep and silence and sitting in grocery store parking lots in the dark. But it's the cost of doing it right. I paid it again.